Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I want you to pull the blankets up a little higher, let the world outside go quiet, and settle in. We're about to journey into a world that exists in the periphery of our history books, a world of whispered contracts, silent footsteps, and the cold, sharp finality of a blade. We're stepping into the grim, unglamorous, and deeply misunderstood world of the medieval assassin. Hollywood and video games have painted them as anti-heroes in sleek leather, masters of forgotten arts who move with the grace of a phantom. The reality, as we'll soon discover, was far less romantic and infinitely more desperate. So before we begin, if you feel so inclined, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps this channel grow. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a pleasure to see our global community gather. Now, let the ambient sounds of your room become a gentle hum, and let's explore the life that nobody ever chose. Let's get one thing straight right from the start. In the grand, muddy, and often brutal tapestry of the Middle Ages, no one woke up on a crisp autumn morning, stretched their arms, and thought, what a fine day to embark on a fulfilling career in targeted homicide. Becoming an assassin wasn't a vocational choice. It was the final, desperate stop at the end of a long, dark tunnel where every other door had been bricked up. It was the career you fell into when society had already chewed you up and decided you weren't worth swallowing. The assassins of this era were not the enigmatic loners forged in the fires of a hidden mountain monastery. They were the forgotten dregs of a harsh world. They were peasants who had lost their land to a greedy lord, soldiers discharged from a losing war with nothing but scars and a proficiency with a knife, or former thieves whose only marketable skill was the ability to be somewhere they weren't supposed to be without making a sound. They were the people so far on the fringes of society that their existence was a footnote, a ghost who could slip through the cracks of the world, commit an act that would change a dynasty, and still be overlooked by the census taker. If you had wealth, you didn't become an assassin, you hired one. If you possessed a title, a plot of land, or even a reasonably healthy goat, you were in management. You had something to lose. But if your only possession was a reputation for being ruthlessly pragmatic, and you could navigate the back alleys of a city blindfolded, then sooner or later, a shadowy figure would slide a small, heavy purse across a grimy tavern table and whisper a name. And that name was never an easy one. You weren't being hired to deal with Bartholomew the gentle beekeeper. Your targets were powerful, insulated, and very, very well guarded. A corrupt bishop with a private army, a baron whose cruelty was legendary, or a merchant whose wealth threatened the king. The pay was a tantalizing whisper of a better life, but the job itself was a scream of terror. Yet, by the time this offer came, the choice had already been made for you by starvation, desperation, or a profound lack of better options. You had no family to protect, no future to build, and certainly no retirement fund to speak of. And let's be brutally honest about the complete absence of job benefits. There was no pension, no public glory, and no sick days. You couldn't exactly put up a sign outside your hovel reading, discreet removals and political adjustments. Inquire within. Your entire professional identity was a lie. When asked what you did, you were a traveling tinker, a seller of rare herbs, a mercenary looking for a less political war. The bloodstains? Oh, that's just beet juice. I'm also a part-time grocer. So, no. The path of the assassin was not a dream. It was a nightmare you walked into with your eyes wide open, because it was marginally better than the nightmare you were already living. You weren't the hero of the story. You weren't even the villain. You were the cold, sharp instrument that did the dirty work, a human footnote who almost certainly wouldn't live long enough to spend the coin you earned. Now, let's shatter the first and most pervasive myth, the myth of training. Forget the montages of a grizzled master teaching a young apprentice the 5-point palm exploding heart technique, by candlelight. There was no hidden dojo, no ancient scrolls of secret killing arts, no wise mentor offering cryptic life lessons over a bowl of rice. The training of a medieval assassin can be best compared to learning how to swim by being thrown into a river during a flash flood. If you survived, you learned something. Most assassins weren't trained in any formal sense, they were simply experienced survivors. They were amateurs who learned on the job, and the curriculum was brutal. Lesson 1: How to climb a castle wall without dislodging a stone and alerting the entire garrison. Lesson 2: How to tell the difference between the snores of a sleeping guard and the snores of a sleeping guard dog. If you had prior military experience, fantastic. It meant you already knew which end of the knife was the dangerous one and how to move without your knees cracking like firewood. If not, well, the act of stabbing is grimly intuitive. It was the after part, the vanishing, the escaping with all your internal organs still inside you, that required a skill born of pure, desperate instinct. Or, more often than not, dumb luck. There were no textbooks, no guild-mandated safety seminars, no orientation day where they handed you a welcome packet and explained the company policy on poisoning. You didn't get a lecture on how to identify a nobleman's body double or the optimal time to strike during a feast. You learned these things while dangling from a tapestry, heart pounding in your throat, realizing you'd just broken into the laundry room instead of the Lord's chambers. And poison? That was a terrifying field of trial and error, with a heavy emphasis on the terror. Sometimes it worked flawlessly. Sometimes your target just got a mild headache and became deeply paranoid about his food for the rest of his life. And sometimes, in the chaos and darkness, you might just poison yourself. There was no medieval equivalent of a poison control center to call. There was only herbal guesswork, a strong constitution, and the hope that you remembered which mushroom was the sleep forever mushroom and which was the violent vomiting for 3 days mushroom. Sure, if you were exceptionally lucky, winning the lottery twice kind of lucky, you might have picked up a few tricks from a seasoned thief or a cynical mercenary. An older, world-weary killer might, in a rare moment of camaraderie, show you how to walk across a gravel path without sounding like a rockslide. But mentorship was not the norm. It was a fleeting, precious anomaly, mostly because assassins don't have a long-term career path that ends in a peaceful retirement. They just stop showing up one day. Your tools were not elegant. You didn't have a perfectly balanced broadsword. You had a dagger you'd likely stolen from a sleeping guard, a garrote made from wire and wood if you were feeling sophisticated, and any other small, sharp object that could be concealed in your boot without making you limp. So, no, you were not some shadow-walking martial arts master. You were a person with calloused hands, quiet feet, and a profoundly unhealthy relationship with dark corners. Success wasn't a product of training. It was a byproduct of survival. You learned to kill by doing it, often messily and inefficiently, and then becoming a ghost before anyone had the chance to remember your face. Your education was a brutal, hands-on affair with zero graduation ceremonies, only a growing collection of bruises, bloodstains, and the gnawing certainty that you were utterly and completely on your own. Let's discuss the primary motivator, the reason you would even consider this line of work in the first place: coin. Cold, hard, beautifully anonymous coin. The promise of it was the lantern in the darkness, the lure that pulled you into this treacherous world. But the reality was that you were often paid in lies and betrayal. When a powerful person hires an assassin, they are not looking for a long-term business relationship. They want a problem solved with no receipt, no paper trail, and absolutely no living witnesses who can connect them to the deed. That includes you. The standard offer was a pouch of silver, half up front, the other half upon completion of the job. That was the honorable deal. But, upon completion of the job, was a wonderfully flexible phrase. It often meant, after we've confirmed you didn't bungle it, didn't leave a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to our very important door, and, ideally, didn't survive long enough to become a future inconvenience. So you do the deed. You slip through shadows like a bad memory, risk life and limb, and perhaps you successfully send a corrupt baron to his final judgment. The act itself is not poetic. It's grimy, intimate, and terrifying. And when you return to the prearranged meeting spot for your final payment, you're often met with nothing. Ah, yes, about that second half of the payment. The client had to flee the city unexpectedly. Terribly sorry. Or, in a far more common and cynical twist, they try to pay you with a knife in the ribs. After all, a quick death is much cheaper than a bag of silver and ensures your silence permanently. Even when you were paid in full, it was never truly enough. It could never compensate for the risk, for the moral corrosion, for the 3 days you spent hiding in a pigsty, sharing your space with fleas and existential dread. You'd receive a handful of coins, a curt, dismissive nod, and the unspoken threat, you were never here. There was also the delightful possibility of the fake contract. This was a favorite tactic for political maneuvering. You'd be hired to eliminate a high-profile target, only to discover the entire setup was a trap. The target was a decoy, and the guards weren't there to protect him, they were there waiting for you. Congratulations, you've just starred in a sting operation, and your reward is a one-way trip to the gallows. And in the event of a legitimate, yet broken, contract, what recourse did you have? You couldn't exactly march into the local magistrate's court and file a grievance. Your Honor, I'd like to present a case of gross contractual misconduct. Lord Blackwood has failed to render final payment for the, expedited retirement of his political rival. The only court you'd ever see would be the one where you were the main exhibit, likely in chains. You learn quickly to demand as much as possible up front, to build your escape plan around the assumption of betrayal, and to trust absolutely no one. Not the client, not their intermediary, and certainly not the greasy little scribe who promised this one job would be your ticket to a new life. It was, in a way, just a much, much shorter one. So you've accepted the contract, fully aware that the payment is a gamble. Now, what about your equipment? Banish all thoughts of fantasy novels and stealth-based video games. There were no spring-loaded wrist blades, no smoke bombs for dramatic exits, no enchanted daggers that glowed in the presence of orcs. Your toolkit was a humble, grim collection of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or conceal under a worn tunic without clanking. If you were truly fortunate, found a sovereign in a dead man's pocket kind of fortunate, you owned a good dagger. Not an ornate, jewel-encrusted work of art. Just a solid piece of steel, sharp, well-balanced, hopefully rust-free, and ideally one that didn't still carry the faint, coppery smell of its previous use. This dagger was your business partner, your only employee, and your entire human resources department. Poison, as we've touched upon, certainly existed. But it was far from the clean, sophisticated solution of fiction. Medieval poisons were a messy, unpredictable science. They were concoctions of plants like nightshade and hemlock, toxic minerals, or even the glands of certain toads. Some might bring on a swift, heart-stopping death. Others might take hours, or even days, to work their grim magic. And some would merely induce a spectacular bout of vomiting, leaving your target alive, angry, and now deeply suspicious of every bowl of soup placed before them. A rope could be a versatile tool. You could use it for climbing, for strangulation, or for tying a door shut to delay pursuit. But you had better be an expert in its use. Fumbling with a knot while your target is waking up is a surefire way to turn a stealth mission into a clumsy, noisy brawl. Nothing kills the element of surprise like muttering, "Wait, is it over, under, and then through the loop?" Bows and crossbows. Effective for killing at a distance, yes, but a logistical nightmare for an assassin. A crossbow is not easily concealed. Trying to smuggle one into a fortified castle while disguised as a wandering minstrel is a high-risk proposition. It practically screams, "I am not here to play the lute." Most assassinations were intimate affairs, conducted up close and personal. There was no time for elegant marksmanship, only for a swift, quiet, and hopefully not so messy that you slip in the aftermath kind of efficiency. And you did not carry backups. There was no secondary weapon slot. If your dagger bent, broke, or was knocked from your hand and skittered under a heavy chest, it was time to improvise. A slate tile from the roof. A rusty nail pried from a floorboard. A heavy pewter tankard wielded with murderous intent. Desperate times called for desperately creative measures. You carried your tools hidden in the seams of your clothing, tucked into your boots, or, if the situation demanded it, baked inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread. You kept them close not just for your own safety, but because in this lonely profession, your weapon was your closest confidant, your sternest boss, and your only viable retirement plan. There were no weapon upgrades, no workbench for tinkering between missions. You didn't polish your kit with pride. You prayed it wouldn't fail you at the critical moment, because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you, alone, poorly equipped, and expected to work miracles with little more than a piece of sharpened metal and a prayer. Assassins were not hired for trivial tasks. No one paid a bag of silver for you to rough up a drunken lout in an alley. You didn't get contracts for Jeff, the perpetually sleepy candlemaker. Your targets were people of consequence, nobles, bishops, powerful merchants, high-ranking military commanders, and sometimes, even royalty. And these individuals were, by necessity and temperament, exceptionally difficult to kill. First, you had to contend with the guards. Not one or two, but dozens. They were armed, often armored, and generally well-fed. They guarded the gates, patrolled the walls, and stood sentry in every major corridor. Some were there to look imposing, daring you to so much as breathe in their direction. You would spend days, even weeks, observing from a distance, memorizing patrol schedules, the specific creak of a certain door, and the precise timing of when the night watchman with the bad lungs had to stop for a wheezing break. Second, there were the castles themselves. These were not welcoming structures with charming front porches. They were stone beasts designed for one purpose, to keep people like you out. They had gatehouses, drawbridges, and the infamous murder holes above the entrance, from which guards could happily drop rocks, arrows, or boiling oil on uninvited guests. Yes, your job description implicitly included the risk of being flambéed for peeking. If you managed to get past the moat, which was often filled with more than just water, you still had to contend with arrow slits, crenellations, and walls thick enough to withstand a siege. Third, you had the domestic staff. The cooks, the scullions, the chambermaids, the stable boys. This was an army of eyes and ears. One wrong move, one unfamiliar face in the servants' quarters, and they would be whispering to the captain of the guard faster than you could stammer an excuse about being the new rat catcher. An assassin wasn't just fighting swords and armor, they were fighting gossip. And in a medieval household, gossip traveled with the speed of light, especially if it meant earning favor or a small reward. And finally, there was your actual target. These people were not naive. They lived in a world of constant political intrigue and lived to be paranoid. They were surrounded by ambitious relatives, backstabbing courtiers, and dozens of people pretending to be their friends. They rarely ate a meal without a food taster. They slept behind multiple locked doors, sometimes with a loyal guard posted just outside. Some of the most cautious nobles employed body doubles or rotated their sleeping chambers nightly, playing a lethal game of musical chairs to thwart would-be killers. Don't get overly excited if you hear your target is attending a grand feast. Yes, they might be inebriated, but so will everyone else. And you'll still have to navigate a room full of royal guards, 3 large dogs with a keen sense of smell, a very alert court jester whose job is to notice everything, and 50 other potential witnesses holding heavy drinking horns. The process of just getting close could take weeks of meticulous, soul-crushing work. Posing as a servant, bribing a disgruntled chambermaid, or spending 2 days concealed in a large wine barrel. And when that one perfect moment finally arrived, you had a single chance. One precise, silent, flawlessly executed strike, followed by a ghostly disappearance. Anything less, and you'd become the next grim decoration dangling from the castle ramparts, a warning to others with a simple sign that read, "He tried." Let's be perfectly frank. When you conjure an image of a medieval assassin, you likely picture someone clad in sleek black robes, perhaps with supple leather bracers and a mysterious hood that casts their face in perpetual shadow. The reality was much less stylish and far more fragrant. Your disguise was less master of stealth and more chronically ill goat herder with something to hide. Disguises in the Middle Ages were a matter of practicality, not high fashion. You didn't have access to custom-tailored cloaks with hidden compartments or articulated leather armor. Your wardrobe consisted of whatever you could steal, scavenge, or trade for. Peasant rags, a monk's heavy woolen robe that was 2 sizes too large, or the slightly too small uniform of a guard that definitely still carried the faint scent of its previous, now deceased owner. The objective was to blend in, but blending in meant looking like everyone else, unwashed, probably limping from some old, untreated injury, and possessing the nervous twitch that comes from a diet of cheap ale and stale bread. You didn't look suspicious because of your dramatic, billowing cloak. You looked suspicious because you were the only one in the room who didn't smell of onions and was constantly adjusting their belt to make sure a dagger wrapped in an old piece of linen hadn't slipped. And forget about masks. There were no stylish Guy Fawkes options. Wearing a face covering in public would immediately mark you as either a leper or a bandit. While this was an excellent strategy for avoiding small talk, it was a terrible one for gaining entry to a nobleman's feast. If anyone asked who you were, you needed a plausible, boring story, and you needed it fast. I am Brother Thomas. I'm here to inspect the tapestries for moth damage. A silent, pious task. Even if your disguise got you past the outer layer of guards, noble households were ecosystems with their own social rules. The servants knew each other. They noticed unfamiliar faces, especially faces that fumbled with a chamber pot or couldn't name the head cook's famously ill-tempered cat. You were always just one. I've never seen you around here before, away from being cornered by 2 burly men-at-arms. And if your disguise actually worked, congratulations. You now had to maintain your cover for hours, possibly days, pretending to be a humble cobbler or a mute servant, all while trying not to stare too intently at the very stab-worthy individual strolling past you. Wigs? Not a thing. If you needed to alter your appearance, your options were smearing mud on your face to look older, squinting to appear more thoughtful, and hoping no one got close enough to notice that your distinguished-looking beard was actually just some stray wool you'd glued to your chin with honey. The truth is, your disguise was never a shield. It was a flimsy curtain that bought you, at best, a few precious minutes of confusion. After that, you had to be gone, invisible, or so utterly convincing in your role that you could talk your way out of a locked room. And if someone saw through your ruse, well, let's just say that being discovered in the bishop's private laundry wearing a nun's habit and holding a garrote is a difficult situation to explain, especially on a holy day. In the dangerous world of medieval assassination, you were a solo act. There was no team, no support crew. You didn't have a wisecracking sidekick with a crossbow, a brilliant alchemist brewing potions in a secret lab, or a handler passing you coded messages and words of encouragement. You had yourself, a piece of sharpened steel, and a deep, abiding case of trust issues. There were no official guilds, at least none that offered benefits or protection. Whispers of a brotherhood of assassins were mostly just tavern tales, stories spun from too much mead and a healthy dose of boredom. You were far more likely to encounter an actual ghost in a haunted castle than another professional killer who wanted to exchange business cards and network. Why this profound isolation? Because in your line of work, the fewer people who knew your name, your face, or even your existence, the longer your life expectancy. Every new contact was a potential risk. Every person you spoke to was a loose tongue that could eventually become a noose around your neck. Even the client who hired you might only know you by a pseudonym. If they knew your real name, you were already doing something wrong. Companionship was a luxury you could not afford. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed the fresh bruises, the faint bloodstains on your tunic that you swore were just wine, and the fact that you always slept with a knife under your pillow. You couldn't settle down, put down roots, or even stay in one town for too long. One mistake, one person recognizing your face from a wanted poster in another city, and your entire life would devolve into a frantic sprint towards the nearest sewer grate. Even other criminals tended to keep their distance. Thieves and smugglers might have their own codes and communities, but you were different. You were the person they whispered about, the one who made powerful people disappear. They feared you, or worse, they saw you as a walking magnet for trouble. No one wanted to share a table with someone whose very profession could attract an angry mob with torches and pitchforks. And you could never expect sympathy or understanding. You couldn't confide in anyone about the psychological toll of your work, the nightmares that followed a particularly grim job. If you talked about what you did, people would assume you were either a dangerous lunatic or a boastful liar. They weren't entirely wrong on the first count. So, you carried your secrets, your scars, and your weapons alone. In taverns, you chose the darkest corner, your back always to a solid wall, your eyes constantly scanning the door. You never drank enough to dull your senses. You never stayed more than a single night. You didn't give your name unless someone paid you to, and even then, it was never your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of being invisible, not just in a crowd, but from every normal human connection you could never have. Let's imagine the scenario. You've accepted the job. You've meticulously planned your infiltration. You've bribed the right guard and disguised yourself as a very convincing, if slightly shifty, chimney sweep. You're in the room. The target is asleep. And then, you hesitate. Maybe the target rolls over, and in the moonlight, they look younger, more vulnerable than you expected. Maybe you hear the faint sound of their child stirring in the next room. Or maybe, at the worst possible moment, a tremor of doubt runs through you, and the hand holding the knife begins to shake like a leaf in a storm. Guess what? You are now, for all intents and purposes, already dead. Because failure for a medieval assassin wasn't a bad performance review. It wasn't a stern talking to from your client. It was a public, agonizing, and often gruesomely theatrical death. The kind of death that involved ropes, fire, breaking wheels, or ingenious iron contraptions with evocative names like, the Heretic's Fork. To miss the kill was to blow the entire operation wide open. Your target would not only survive, but they would immediately raise the alarm, screaming that a would-be murderer was in their chambers. Suddenly, you're no longer a ghost. You're a wanted man, with a detailed description, tall, nervous, smells faintly of soot, and a crude but effective sketch being nailed to every church door and tavern wall in a 50-mile radius. And those guards you so cleverly snuck past before. Now they're highly motivated and have a personal stake in finding you. Sometimes, it wasn't even your target you had to fear the most. It was your client. If you failed, you were no longer a useful tool. You were a catastrophic liability. You were a person who could be captured, tortured, and interrogated. A person who could, and would, talk. The very people who paid you would be the first to issue a second contract, this time, on you, to silence their mistake permanently. There were no second chances. No, my apologies, the blade slipped, I'll give it another go tomorrow night. You had one opportunity, one fleeting moment of terrible perfection. If you squandered it, the best-case scenario was dying quickly before someone with a pair of hot pincers could find out who hired you. Failure also brought a silent, personal shame. You didn't just fail to kill someone, you failed to be invisible, to be perfect. And for an assassin, perfection was the only thing that kept you alive. Anything less was the equivalent of painting a large target on your own back and humming loudly to attract attention. It didn't matter how many jobs you'd successfully completed before. No one cared about your 12 previous successes. In this profession, you are only as good as your last kill. And if your last kill didn't actually happen, you had better start running. So, you did it. Against all odds, the plan worked. The dagger found its mark. There were no screams, no alerted guards, just the quiet, final thud of a body hitting the floor. A very important person is now a very former person. Congratulations. Now run. Run for your life. Because being a successful assassin in the Middle Ages didn't mean you got to sit back on a rooftop, sipping wine and watching the city lights twinkle below. It meant you were now the most wanted person in the city, fleeing through filthy back alleys with someone else's blood cooling on your boots and the baying of hounds already starting in the distance. There was no victory lap. No celebratory drink with your non-existent colleagues. No professional debrief with your client. You didn't even have a moment to admire your handiwork. The instant your blade did its job, your new job began, escaping the wrath of everyone who now wanted to kill you in a variety of painful and inventive ways. Guards would be swarming the area. The city gates would be shut. The horses you'd hoped to steal would be on the other side of town. You were probably injured yourself. A good assassin planned their escape route with even more care than the assassination itself. You needed fallback routes, backup disguises, and pre-arranged safe houses, which were usually just a damp cellar belonging to someone who owed you a favor. You needed a boatman who didn't ask questions paid off in advance, because the entire city would be on lockdown within the hour. No powerful family wanted a scandal, and lockdown meant armed checkpoints, frantic searches, and a dozen furious men-at-arms who had all just been shown a sketch of your face and given the instruction, find him. And let's talk about the client. Assuming they even intended to pay you the second half of your fee, they weren't going to meet you at a designated spot with a warm handshake and a thank you note. They would be making themselves scarce, too. Because an assassin who has just successfully completed a high-profile job is arguably the most dangerous person in the world to their former employer. You know their darkest secret. You've proven you can get into heavily guarded places and kill powerful people. From their perspective, you're a loose end that could one day blackmail them, or worse, take a contract against them. So even in success, you walked away with a pouch of coin in one hand and a giant, invisible target on your back. And what did you win, really? A few weeks of paranoid, fitful sleep in haylofts. The need to bribe ferry captains, shave your beard in the dark using a shard of reflective metal, and pretend your name is Brother Lucian while trying to blend in with a group of monks heading east. Because success didn't buy you peace. It just reset the game, forcing you to start over in a new city, under a new name, with even more people who might recognize your face. So yes, you made the kill. Now run like hell is chasing you. Because it is. As if being a hunted, poorly paid, and perpetually lonely killer wasn't miserable enough, you also had to contend with the wonderfully imaginative paranoia of the general populace. In the Middle Ages, assassins weren't just feared as criminals, they were often seen as something supernatural, something cursed. To the average peasant tilling their field, you weren't just a man with a knife and a grim purpose. You were a creature of the night, an unholy being who consorted with demons and could walk through walls. Why else would you be able to slip past a dozen armed guards and vanish without a trace? Formal logic wasn't a popular pastime, but superstition. Oh, superstition was a roaring bonfire. There were tales that assassins could shape-shift into animals. Others claimed you were literally invisible to all but the most pious. A popular belief was that assassins made pacts with dark spirits, allowing them to kill with a mere whisper or a cursed glance. Imagine trying to buy a loaf of bread in a small village, only to hear a mother quickly hush her child and mutter, "Don't look him in the eye, he'll sour the milk." Even your simple tools were viewed with superstitious dread. The dagger you carried? Clearly, it was forged with black magic and quenched in the blood of an innocent. The poisons you might use? That wasn't just herbalism, that was witchcraft, probably brewed in a cauldron with a severed finger for a stirring spoon under a blood moon. You might think this reputation for dark power would be an advantage. After all, if people are terrified of you, they'll leave you alone, right? The reality was far more dangerous. Superstitious fear doesn't lead to quiet avoidance, it leads to preemptive violence. A frightened mob doesn't pause to ask questions. They throw stones, light torches, and scream things like, "Burn the sorcerer before he calls down a plague upon our crops." Your very reputation made people dangerously overreactive. The moment someone of importance died unexpectedly, from a sudden illness, a fall down the stairs, or choking on a chicken bone, someone, somewhere, would whisper, "It was a shadow man, it was him." You could find yourself being hunted simply for being the quiet, unfamiliar stranger in the same town where a suspicious death occurred. This meant you could never stay in one place for long. Linger for more than a few days, and you'd find the local priest ringing a church bell while 5 grim-faced farmers stood outside your door, holding their pitchforks like they'd been rehearsing for this moment their entire lives. And heaven help you if you were caught with anything that seemed even remotely strange, a pouch of dried herbs for treating a wound, a few foreign coins, or even just an unfamiliar accent. In a world that believed monsters wore human skin, being too quiet, too skilled, or too different was enough to get you condemned. And in medieval logic, a threat like that needed to be neutralized quickly, and preferably with fire. Ah, poison. The assassin's supposed weapon of choice. The tool of elegance. A quiet, tidy kill with no messy struggle, no clanging steel, no blood on the tapestries. Just a sip from a goblet, a slow stagger, a final, gentle sigh, and, scene. That's the theory, anyway. In practice, successfully poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to perform delicate brain surgery with a soup ladle in the middle of a hurricane. First and foremost, the poisons themselves were notoriously unreliable. You didn't have access to a vial of pure, lab-grade cyanide or a neat, fast-acting capsule. Your pharmacy was the forest and the field. You had plants, mushrooms, and minerals, each with varying levels of toxicity and wildly unpredictable effects. You had to gather them, grind them, and mix them, all while praying you got the recipe right. There was no scientific method for dosing. You just eyeballed it. A pinch too little, and your target merely gets a bad case of indigestion and doubles his guard. A pinch too much, and you might die from accidental exposure before you even get near the kitchen. Speaking of kitchens, medieval kitchens were not quiet, sterile environments. They were chaotic, steamy, greasy hubs of activity. You couldn't just saunter in and sprinkle a little nightshade into the Duke's stew. You had to bribe a kitchen boy, impersonate a cook, or sneak in during the dead of night, all while avoiding the head cook, who ruled his domain with the authority of a king and the temper of a cornered badger. And if your target was a person of any real importance, their food went through a security checkpoint that would impress a modern-day Secret Service agent. Meals were often prepared by trusted chefs and then sampled by a series of official tasters. Sometimes, even a dog was employed to take the first bite. By the time the food reached your target's plate, it had been blessed, sniffed, and tasted by half the household. But let's say you do it. You manage to bypass all security and introduce the poison. It goes undetected, and the target consumes it. The next phase was a terrifying waiting game. Some poisons acted within minutes. Others took hours, or even days. One moment, your mark is laughing boisterously at a jester's joke. The next, he's clutching his stomach, his face turning a pale shade of green, demanding to see his physician and his priest, in that order. And if he survived? Guess who becomes the primary suspect? Not the cook. Not the taster. You, the quiet, mysterious stranger with a suspicious knowledge of herbs and a twitchy demeanor. Poisoning was not the clean, efficient method of murder it's made out to be. It was a messy, high-risk, slow-burn gamble, with a dozen variables that could go wrong. And if you were caught, you weren't given a swift execution. You were given a lengthy, painful interrogation with a variety of unpleasant tools until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the king down to the royal hamster. You'd think that if you managed to alter the course of a nation by removing a tyrant, disrupting a royal succession, or silencing a warmongering bishop, your name would be etched into the secret histories of the world. Nope. You were an assassin. Your name was designed to be disposable. Your very purpose was to be forgotten. At best, you became a rumor. A hooded figure seen near the castle the night the Duke died. A foreigner with cold eyes who paid for his ale with a strange coin. The quiet man in the corner of the inn who never finished his drink. You could pull off the most significant, history-altering kill of the century, and the official record would still read, Lord Fairfax passed away unexpectedly in his sleep. The family requests privacy at this difficult time. In fact, that was the entire point. Your client didn't want a hero or a story. They wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew a murder even took place, let alone who committed it, the safer the client was. Your anonymity was their shield. So your name, if you were foolish enough to use a real one, was buried the moment the contract was fulfilled. You didn't sign your work. You didn't leave a calling card. You certainly didn't brag about your accomplishments in a tavern. You didn't exist outside the single, violent moment of the kill. And if, by some chance, someone did know your name, that person was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had a notoriously short shelf life. Forget about honor or recognition. There were no secret medals for a job well done. No stone monuments erected in a hidden grove for the man who prevented a war with a single, well-placed dagger. If a noble wanted a statue, they commissioned one of themselves, probably looking heroic on a horse. You were destined for a wooden box in an unmarked grave or, if things went poorly, a head on a spike with a sign that simply read, "Traitor." Sometimes, your name was only remembered so that it could be cursed in hushed tones. You became a whispered cautionary tale. Don't cross the new king. Remember what happened to the old one? And the man who did it, gone. Vanished like smoke. That was your legacy. Not fame, not even infamy. Just a profound and total absence. You weren't supposed to leave your mark on history. You were supposed to erase yourself from it. And if you ever stuck around long enough to become known, you had already made a fatal error. In the medieval world, heroes were remembered. Assassins were erased. So, you've survived the mission. You've successfully completed the job, and through some miracle of fate, you've even managed to collect your payment. Now, all that's left is to lie low, keep your head down, and trust that your client, having gotten what they wanted, will honor their end of the bargain and protect your identity. Right? Wrong. Because in the dark and treacherous world of medieval assassination, there was one commandment more sacred than "don't get caught." It was this: never, ever trust anyone, especially the person who signs your checks. Your client, whether a power-hungry noble, a desperate merchant, or a bishop with ambitions that far outstripped his piety, did not hire you out of admiration for your skills. They hired you because they needed a monstrous task done, and you were the sharpest, most disposable tool available. The moment that task was complete, your status changed instantly. You were no longer an asset. You were a liability. You knew too much. You knew who wanted whom dead. You knew when, where, why, and, most dangerously, you knew that they were willing to kill to achieve their goals. This knowledge made you a threat, not just to their enemies, but directly to them. So what was their next logical move? Often, it was to clean up. They might simply vanish, denying they ever met you, leaving you to fend for yourself if the authorities came knocking. Or, far more proactively, they would send someone else, another desperate, nameless killer, after you. The goal was to tie off the final loose end of the contract with something sharper and more permanent than ink. There were even documented cases of clients employing a double-blind strategy, hiring one assassin to perform the kill, and a second one to eliminate the first immediately afterward. It was a grimly efficient form of risk management. And if you were ever foolish enough to try and blackmail a client, to threaten them with exposure, that was a bold move. It was also, invariably, your last. Powerful people in the Middle Ages did not negotiate with the help. They crushed them. If your client possessed a shred of honor, a rare and often fatal condition in their circles, you might get your payment and be left alone. But even then, you could never be sure. You would have to spend the rest of your days assuming that they were watching you, that they had someone memorizing your face, your walk, and the places you frequented. You were the walking, breathing embodiment of their greatest secret. A secret that couldn't be allowed to talk. Even your greatest success was not enough to earn their trust. Because in their eyes, if you could kill for them once, you could kill for someone else again. And no one, least of all the person who hired you, ever wanted to be next on the list. Let's say, through some combination of incredible skill, staggering luck, and profound cynicism, you beat the odds. You survived the missions, the betrayals, the poisons, and the paranoia. You have outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own sense of right and wrong. Now what? Do you retire? Absolutely not. Because in the medieval world, assassins did not get a retirement plan. There were no farewell banquets, no quiet cottages by the sea, no pension paid out in gold coins and grateful silence. You didn't fade away into a peaceful, pastoral life. You just vanished. Or you died. Often, both. The fundamental problem was simple: you were never truly safe. Even if you walked away from the life didn't walk away from you. You had too many secrets rattling around in your head. Too many names, too many dates, too many faces. You were a living archive of other people's sins, and archives have a tendency to be burned. People didn't want you retired, they wanted you forgotten. And the most effective way to ensure someone is forgotten is to bury them. Even if no old client came looking for you, and that is a monumental if, you had to live with the constant, gnawing fear that someone, somewhere, might. That a new, younger assassin, eager to make a name for himself, had just been given a contract for an aging, shadowy figure who was once someone very dangerous. So you would change your name for the 10th time. You'd move to a remote village on the coast where no one asked too many questions. You'd invent a new past, faking a limp and claiming you were once a fisherman or a guard in a distant city. But even then, you would never truly rest. You wouldn't sleep soundly through the night. You'd avoid large crowds. In the tavern, you would always, instinctively, take the seat that faced the door. You'd keep your old dagger hidden under a loose floorboard, next to a small pouch of coins you could never bring yourself to spend, because you could still remember the face of the man who paid you. And you couldn't even trust yourself. Years of hypervigilance, of silent killings and frantic escapes, rewires the brain. Every unexpected knock on the door would make your heart leap into your throat. Every stranger who looked at you for a moment too long on the road might be someone who recognized you. You stopped having pleasant dreams, because dreaming was a vulnerability. You couldn't form attachments. You couldn't laugh too loudly. You couldn't relax. You lived the life of a ghost haunting the body of a man. The truth is, there was no endgame for a medieval assassin. There was only a slow, cold fade into obscurity. Always moving, always watching, until one day, you simply slipped into the final darkness, and no one in the world even noticed you were gone. And perhaps, after a life like that, such a quiet, unremarked end was the greatest mercy you could have hoped for. By now, you've probably come to a certain conclusion. Being a medieval assassin wasn't a darkly romantic calling. It wasn't noble. It wasn't cool. It wasn't even, in the long run, particularly profitable. It was a grim, thankless, and brutally short career path, wrapped in blood-stained linen and perpetually followed by a crowd of people who wanted you dead. And you? You wouldn't last. Not a week. Maybe not even a single day. You would arrive with all the wrong assumptions, fed by stories and songs. You'd expect to be a sleek, controlled whisper in the dark. But what you'd really be is cold, hungry, and one bad decision away from a hangman's noose. You'd slip into a fortified town, your cloak pulled tight, ready for your mission, only to discover that your information is 3 days old. The target has moved. The guards you were told were lazy are actually drunk and dangerously trigger-happy. And the stable boy you paid for information has just sold you out to the captain of the guard for a mug of warm ale and a heel of bread. You'd hesitate at the critical moment. You'd stab the wrong person in the dark. You'd be spotted by a chambermaid who once saw your face in a market 2 towns over. And in that instant, you are no longer a phantom. You are the problem. And then what? You run. But you're not accustomed to the terrain of the past. The thick, sucking mud of the unpaved streets, the treacherous, uneven cobblestones, the sheer, bewildering number of loose chickens underfoot. You slip, you fall, you're tackled by a guard named Edgar who is having a very bad day and is looking for someone to take it out on. Even if, by some miracle, you succeeded, what would you have? No allies. No honor. No future. Just a life of paranoia, of looking over your shoulder, and the dawning realization that the best you can ever hope for is to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village that still thinks a bad harvest is caused by fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't want to. The life of the assassin wasn't a path to power, it was a cruel machine that chewed up desperate people and spat out nothing but ghosts and shadows. It offered a kind of purpose, but no peace. It gave you the power to change history, but only by erasing yourself from it completely. And the only thing waiting for you at the end of that long, dark road was silence. A final, profound silence that no one would ever question, because no one would even remember you were there to begin with. We're not just telling a story from history. We're unearthing a legend, a woman who was less a queen and more a force of nature, wrapped in prophecy and shadow. We're talking about a mother whose love was a weapon, whose faith could move armies, and whose rage could topple dynasties. This is the story of Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great. But to truly understand her, we have to travel back, long before she was the feared dowager queen of a sprawling empire. Before the whispers of poison and palace intrigue followed her like a perfume, she was known by another name, Myrtale. She was a princess from a place that felt ancient even then, the rugged, mist-shrouded kingdom of Epirus. This wasn't Athens with its gleaming marble and sophisticated philosophy. Epirus was a land of old gods, of whispering forests and mountain peaks that scraped the sky. Her people, the Molossians, were a proud, tribal society who didn't just respect history, they claimed to be a part of it. They traced their lineage all the way back to the great Achilles, the hero of the Trojan War. And whether the blood of a demigod truly pulsed in Myrtale's veins or not, one thing was undeniable, she was not born to be a footnote in someone else's story. From her earliest years, Myrtale was steeped in a world that ran parallel to the politics of men. Her education was in ritual, mystery, and the deep, chthonic currents of ancient religion. She was not the kind of princess you'd find practicing courtly smiles or embroidering tapestries. Her passions were far more primal. She was drawn to the frenzied, ecstatic rites of the cult of Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and religious ecstasy. Imagine it, moonlit nights in sacred groves, women dancing barefoot on the cool earth, their hair unbound, their minds open to the divine, entering states of trance where the barrier between the mortal and the immortal simply dissolved. This wasn't a polite, state-sanctioned religion. This was raw, personal, and utterly transformative. Her connection to the divine was not performative, it felt cellular. She didn't just worship the gods, she sought to channel them. And this is where her legend truly begins to take shape, particularly with her famous affinity for snakes. Ancient sources, most likely penned by men who were equal parts terrified and mesmerized by her, claim she kept sacred serpents in her private chambers. They say she would allow them to coil on her bed as she slept, their cool scales a familiar presence in the dark. Now, was this a literal, everyday reality? Or was it the kind of slander that powerful, unconventional women have always attracted like flies to honey? We'll never truly know. But the story stuck, because it felt true to her essence. To her allies, it was a sign of her divine favor, a mark of her connection to the earth and its oldest powers. To her enemies, it made her something unnatural, something dangerous. It made her a witch. Her power, then, didn't ignite in a throne room or on a battlefield. It was kindled in the uneasy flicker of torchlight, among the whispers of priestesses and the sinuous, curling bodies of serpents. She was more than a princess. She was becoming a living oracle, a woman who seemed touched by something far older than politics and colder and more patient than steel. So, when Philip II of Macedon, brilliant, brutal, a military genius, and famously insatiable in his appetites for both power and women, arrived on the sacred island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he wasn't just looking for another political match. He was a man of immense, practical ambition, but he also understood the power of myth. And on that island, he didn't just meet a beautiful Epirote princess. He met a mystery he felt compelled to possess. He met Myrtale. Their marriage, which followed shortly after, wasn't merely a political alliance to secure Macedon's western border. It was a collision of prophecy and power, of raw ambition and ancient mysticism. And from the very first night, it was draped in omens. Some chroniclers claimed that lightning tore across the sky on their wedding night, a divine seal of approval from Zeus himself. Others, more intimately, wrote that Myrtale, who would soon take the name Olympias in honor of Philip's victory at the Olympic Games, dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb, setting her alight with a fire that would spread across the world. All of this would be polished into legend over the years, of course. But one thing is certain. The union of the pragmatic warrior king and the serpent priestess didn't just create a child. It created Alexander the Great. And from the moment she felt his first kick, Olympias intended to forge his destiny, not with gentle hands, but with fire and will. The marriage of Olympias and Philip II was never going to be the stuff of fairy tales. You don't put two apex predators in the same enclosure and expect tranquility. From the very beginning, their union was a combustible, intoxicating mix of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, a man who reshaped the very concept of warfare and politics in Greece, was ruthless, charismatic, and already collecting wives like a connoisseur collects fine art. He married Olympias around 357 BCE. She was likely just a teenager, perhaps 18 or 19, but to call her naive would be a profound mistake. She saw in Philip a man whose ambition was a mirror to her own, a force of nature that could give her the platform her spirit demanded. Perhaps she even saw in him a divinely ordained partner for her spiritual destiny. Macedon itself was not an easy place to be queen. It was a kingdom forged in iron and ambition, a court where kings were often assassinated by their own bodyguards, where cousins plotted against cousins, and brothers were seen as rivals from birth. It was a high-stakes, high-octane environment. But Olympias, the priestess from the misty mountains of Epirus, walked into the palace at Pella with her head held high, her gaze already fixed on the ultimate prize, ensuring her bloodline would not just rule Macedon, but define it. Their relationship was tempestuous from the start. Philip, for all his political and military genius, was not a man built for monogamy. His polygamy was a tool of statecraft. Each new wife was a new alliance, a new treaty sealed in the flesh, a way to pacify a conquered tribe or win the loyalty of a powerful noble family. But Olympias refused to be just another name on a list. She was not one to sit quietly in the women's quarters and fade into the background. She held her own court, maintained her own network of political alliances, and continued her deep engagement with the religious mysteries that had defined her. She was known to consult oracles constantly, seeking glimpses into her own future, and, no doubt, into the fate of her mercurial husband. Then came the birth of their son, Alexander, in 356 BCE. Even this momentous event was immediately wrapped in celestial drama, spun into a tapestry of myth. The legends that had begun on their wedding night now intensified. The dream of the thunderbolt striking her womb became a foundational story, suggesting the child was not merely Philip's son, but the son of Zeus. It was said that on the day of his birth, 2 eagles perched on the roof of their home, a sign of dominion over both Europe and Asia. Philip, away on campaign, reportedly received 3 pieces of good news on the same day. His general Parmenion had defeated the Illyrians, his horse had won at the Olympic Games, and his wife had given birth to a son. Overwhelmed by this confluence of good fortune, he was said to have had his own vision, a dream in which he sealed Olympias's womb with a signet ring engraved with the image of a lion. A literal lion. Whether Philip and Olympias truly believed these divine signs or simply recognized their immense propaganda value is a moot point. They acted as if they were true. They cultivated the narrative that Alexander was different, that he was touched by the gods, destined not merely to rule a backwater kingdom like Macedon, but the entire world. Yet, even as this golden child was celebrated, the cracks in the royal marriage were deepening into chasms. Olympias deeply resented Philip's other wives, but her fury reached a new level with his marriage, later in life, to a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. This was far more than a simple domestic squabble or a case of jealousy. This was a direct political and existential threat. Olympias was from Epirus, an outsider. Cleopatra Eurydice was a true-born Macedonian, the niece of one of Philip's most powerful generals, Attalus. Any son she bore Philip would, in the eyes of the proud and often xenophobic Macedonian nobility, be of pure blood. A full-blooded Macedonian heir would be a direct challenge to the half-Epirot Alexander's claim to the throne. Olympias saw this with terrifying clarity. The palace at Pella was not a home, it was a viper's nest. And she would use every tool at her disposal, every snake, every dream, every ritual, and every whispered rumor, to ensure that her son would not just be remembered by history, but that he would be the one to write it. She was no longer Myrtale, the mystical princess. She was Olympias, the mother of a demigod, and she would let no one stand in the way of his throne without facing her divine and very earthly wrath. By the time Alexander was a burgeoning teenager, a prodigy being tutored by Aristotle himself, the Macedonian palace in Pella had transformed from a tense household into a full-blown war zone of veiled insults, political maneuvering, and simmering, bitter rivalries. Olympias wasn't just fighting for her own influence anymore, she was locked in a cold war for her son's survival and his future. She knew perfectly well that the court was filled with snakes. But she was the one who had taught them how to bite. Philip II, now at the zenith of his power, had begun to publicly and privately distance himself from her. He was campaigning more, drinking more, and perhaps worst of all, he was listening more to his purely Macedonian advisers, who viewed the proud, foreign-born queen with suspicion. The final, irreparable blow came with his marriage to the young noblewoman, Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with the later, more famous Cleopatra of Egypt. This marriage was different. It wasn't just another strategic alliance with a foreign power. It was an internal one. It was Philip signaling a shift, an embrace of his Macedonian roots, and a potential pivot away from the heir he had with Olympias. To Olympias, this wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a public declaration of war on her son's legitimacy. The wedding celebration was an unmitigated disaster, a perfect storm of alcohol, arrogance, and ambition. At the feast, Cleopatra's uncle, the general Attalus, thoroughly drunk and emboldened by his new familial connection to the king, stood up to give a toast. He didn't toast to the happy couple. Instead, he loudly urged the Macedonians to pray to the gods for a legitimate heir to the throne. The insult was breathtaking in its audacity. He was publicly calling Alexander a bastard, right in front of him and the king. He was questioning whether Philip was even his father, playing on the very myths of divine conception that Olympias herself had so carefully cultivated. It was meant to be a fatal blow, but Olympias had a knack for turning poison into power. Let them whisper. Let them believe her son was the child of Zeus. In a world of men, what could make him more untouchable than that? Alexander, young and hot-tempered, was not so strategic. He exploded. "You villain," he reportedly screamed, hurling his cup at Attalus, "am I then a bastard?" Philip, also drunk, lurched to his feet, drew his sword, and staggered towards his own son, intending to strike him down. But in his inebriated rage, he tripped over a couch and collapsed in a heap on the floor. It was a moment of profound, pathetic symbolism. Alexander, looking down at the sprawled figure of his father, the most powerful man in Greece, sneered, "Look, men. Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he can't even make it from one couch to another." The break was complete. Alexander stormed out of the feast. Olympias, seeing her position as untenable, left Macedon entirely, retreating to her homeland of Epirus where her brother was king. But this was no defeat. It was a strategic masterstroke. In Epirus, she wasn't an exiled queen, she was royalty in her own right, a revered figure with deep connections and influence. From there, she could gather support, whisper in the right ears, and watch from a safe distance as Philip's court, now deprived of her stabilizing, if intimidating, presence, began to rot from within. She didn't need to be physically present in the palace to be its most dangerous occupant. Then, just as Philip was at the absolute peak of his power, on the eve of his grand invasion of the Persian Empire, a campaign that would have cemented his legacy as the greatest conqueror of his age, the unthinkable happened. At the wedding of his own daughter, also named Cleopatra, he was assassinated. Stabbed to death by one of his own bodyguards, a young man named Pausanias. A shockwave ripped through the ancient world. The question echoed through every marble corridor and torchlit hall: who did it? Was it just Pausanias, a jilted bodyguard with a personal vendetta against the king? Was it the result of a conspiracy among Macedonian nobles who feared Philip's absolute power? Was it the Persians, trying to decapitate the invasion before it began? Was it Alexander himself, seizing his moment? Or, and this was the whisper that was softest but also the loudest, was it Olympias? No one could prove it. No one dared to accuse her publicly. But the timing was too perfect, the outcome too convenient. She had the motive, the means through her network of contacts, and the absolute ruthlessness to see it through. The evidence was circumstantial, but damningly so. After all, within days of Philip's death, his newest wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, and her newborn infant child, the legitimate heir Attalus had toasted to, were dead. Murdered. Some say by Olympias's own hand. The serpent had returned to the palace garden. And now, nothing stood between her son and the throne of the world. With Philip dead and the kingdom of Macedon reeling in a state of confusion and mourning, Olympias made her move. While other powerful figures scrambled to understand the chaos, to position themselves, to hedge their bets, she acted. Her actions were swift, brutal, and surgically decisive. First on her list was the rival who posed the most immediate threat, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen, and her infant daughter. According to the most chilling accounts, which have the ring of truth given Olympias's flair for the dramatic, she didn't just have her rival killed. She made her death a public spectacle, a symbolic and humiliating ritual of vengeance. One version of the story, told by the historian Justin, is particularly horrific. He claims that Olympias had the infant girl murdered first, perhaps even thrown onto a brazier of hot coals right in front of her mother. Then, she presented the grieving Cleopatra with a choice of instruments for her own suicide, a rope, a sword, or a cup of poison. It was a demonstration of absolute, cold-blooded power. Another source, Pausanias, the travel writer, not the assassin, says Cleopatra was forced to hang herself. Whatever the grim details, the outcome and the message were the same: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood a fundamental and brutal truth that many royal mothers in history refused to accept: in the unforgiving mathematics of dynastic succession, mercy is a liability. A rival claimant, no matter how small or innocent, is not a child, they are a future civil war. They are a banner for your enemies to rally around. And Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her entire bloodline brutally and permanently erased, she could turn her full attention to securing Alexander's accession. Her son, now 20 years old, was already a force to be reckoned with, bold, brilliant, trained by Aristotle in philosophy and by his father in war. He was declared king by the army and the nobility with surprisingly little opposition. But do not be fooled. It wasn't just his own charisma or his father's formidable legacy that made his transition to power so smooth. It was his mother, working tirelessly in the shadows. She was the one who knew which generals needed to be threatened, which nobles needed to be flattered, and which potential enemies needed to be quietly removed. She was not merely protecting her son's rise to power, she was the chief engineer of it. Alexander himself did not always approve of her methods. He reportedly expressed his disgust at the brutal violence against Cleopatra's family. But he also did nothing to stop it, nor did he punish his mother for it. Because deep down, in the pragmatic core he inherited from his father, he knew what Olympias had always known: power demands blood. And in the treacherous court of Macedon, bloodlines were both a sacred blessing and a deadly curse. With her son now firmly on the throne as Alexander III of Macedon, Olympias began to recede slightly from the public stage. But this was no retirement. She simply shifted her strategy from open, frontal assaults to whispered influence and clandestine guidance. As Alexander prepared to launch the great Persian expedition his father had planned, she remained behind in Pella. She was not a passive queen mother, wringing her hands and waiting for news. She was the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She consulted oracles on his behalf, performed sacred rituals to ensure his safety and success, and sent him sacred relics to carry into battle. In the worldview of Olympias, her son's mission was not merely a military campaign for territory and gold. It was a divine quest. Alexander wasn't just going to war, he was going to fulfill a prophecy that she herself had nurtured since his conception. She had done the impossible. She had weathered political exile, she had navigated the deadly currents of a polygamous court, she had seen her husband assassinated, and she had cleansed the palace of her rivals. She had crowned her son. Now, she would guard his nascent empire from behind the curtain, with teeth bared and eyes wide open, ready to strike at any threat, whether it came from Macedon, Persia, or the heavens themselves. As Alexander marched east, carving a path of conquest that would lead him to the edges of the known world, Olympias remained behind in Macedon. She was a queen without a king, a mother without her son beside her, but she was anything but powerless. Her official title was Queen Mother, but make no mistake, she saw herself as the true regent, ruling in all but name. Though Alexander had officially handed the regency of Macedon and Greece to Antipater, one of his most trusted and experienced generals, Olympias flatly refused to be sidelined. It was an arrangement doomed to fail. She saw Antipater not as an ally, but as an obstacle, an old guard bureaucrat who stood between her and her rightful influence. Their relationship quickly devolved into a bitter Cold War fought through intermediaries and ink. She wrote letters to her son constantly. These were not the sweet, doting letters of a distant mother. They were political briefings, intelligence reports, and spiritual directives, all laced with the unique blend of maternal love and venom that only Olympias could produce. And Alexander, thousands of miles away in the deserts of Egypt or the plains of Persia, read every single word. She advised him on strategy. She warned him about the loyalties of his own generals, planting seeds of doubt that would fester over time. She criticized his growing fascination with Persian customs, his decision to take foreign wives, and, most audaciously, his flirtation with declaring himself a god. No one else in the world would dare to speak to the great conqueror with such candor. But Olympias was never afraid. She spoke to him as a mother, yes, but also as a high priestess reminding a demigod of his true source of power, her. Back in Macedon, Antipater grew increasingly frustrated and resentful. Olympias undermined him at every opportunity. She used her immense personal prestige, her unshakable religious authority, and her deep family ties in Epirus and Thessaly to stir up opposition against his rule. She was a master of propaganda. She could spread a rumor like wildfire, and with Olympias, a carefully placed whisper could be more devastating than a phalanx charge. She cultivated a network of spies and informants, keeping a close watch on Antipater's every move. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander grew more urgent, more paranoid. She relentlessly painted Antipater as a traitor in waiting, a second Philip, a man whose ambition would eventually lead him to betray and usurp the throne. Beware of Antipater, she would write, warning that he was building his own power base, positioning his own sons for influence, and plotting to seize the kingdom for himself. Whether she truly believed every word of this or was simply projecting her own fears of losing control, the effect was the same. She kept pressing her son to remove him, to recall him, to neutralize the threat. Alexander, however, was caught in an impossible position. He needed Antipater. He needed a firm, capable hand to keep order in Greece and to funnel a constant stream of fresh troops and supplies to his ever-advancing army in Asia. And so, he hesitated. He tried to placate his mother, sending her lavish gifts, but he refused to act against his regent. And so, the rift between the Serpent Queen in Pella and the old general who governed in her son's name widened into an unbridgeable canyon. Olympias watched. She waited. But beneath the veneer of religious rites and maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She had not endured decades of palace warfare, betrayal, and bloodshed only to be ruled over by a common soldier, no matter how distinguished. As Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean to the Indus River, Olympias saw cracks forming. From her perspective, her son was taking on too much, trusting too many foreign advisors, and drifting dangerously far from the mother, the gods, and the Macedonian traditions that had made him great in the first place. She fundamentally believed his victories were a product of divine favor, a favor that she, his high priestess, helped to secure. And if he forgot that, well, Olympias knew a thing or two about how to remind kings of who they really were, even if that king was her own magnificent, world-conquering son. When the news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BCE, it didn't arrive like a clap of thunder. It arrived like a silent, cold dagger to the heart. For Olympias, this was not just the devastating loss of a son. It was the instantaneous collapse of the world she had spent her entire adult life building. Her boy, the divine storm she had prophesied, raised, and unleashed upon the world, was gone at the age of 32. And he had left behind no clear heir, no designated successor, only a power vacuum of terrifying proportions. The mighty empire he had carved out with his sword was already beginning to fracture. His generals, his so-called successors, or diadochi, were already circling, dividing up his vast territories like jackals around a lion's kill. In Macedon, her old nemesis Antipater still held power, his position now stronger than ever. And he had no love for Olympias. Worse, her own daughter, Cleopatra, Alexander's full sister, was now the most valuable bachelorette in the world, being courted by rival generals, each one hoping to use her royal bloodline as a claim to the whole fractured empire. Olympias, a master of political calculus, saw what was coming. Civil war wasn't a possibility, it was an inevitability. And once again, she would have to act to protect her bloodline. But this time, she no longer had the shield of Alexander. What she had, instead, was the last living piece of him, his infant son, Alexander IV, born to his Bactrian wife, Roxana, shortly after his death. Roxana and the baby, now in Macedon, were acutely vulnerable. A foreign princess and a half-Bactrian heir in a court of xenophobic Macedonian warlords were targets. But Olympias recognized that the infant was also a weapon. He was the only direct, male descendant of Alexander the Great. His birthright was the single most legitimate claim to the entire empire. So, the old queen allied herself with the young widow and her child, forming a matriarchal bloc determined to protect the boy and use his claim to stake their own power in the bloody political free-for-all that was to come. But the tide of power was turning against her. The very generals who had once bowed to Alexander had no interest in kneeling before his mother or his foreign widow. They had armies now. They had ambitions. And they had long, bitter grudges. Olympias didn't flinch. She had faced down kings, traitors, and assassins. A few upstart warlords with stolen crowns and borrowed spears were not going to intimidate her. So she plotted. She waited. She watched as her great enemy, Antipater, finally died of old age, only to be replaced as regent by his son, Cassander, a man with ice in his veins, a personal hatred for Alexander's memory, and absolutely no tolerance for the old queen's games. It was only a matter of time before these two forces, the serpent mother of Alexander the Great and the cold-eyed usurper who wanted her and her entire legacy buried, would collide. Alexander the man was gone. But his shadow was still vast and dark. And Olympias was still coiled within it, ready for one last strike. Years after Alexander's death, as his once glorious empire crumbled into a brutal, globe-spanning civil war, Olympias made her most audacious move yet. She decided to return to Macedon, not as a grieving, marginalized mother, but as a political and military force of divine fury. The regency of the kingdom had splintered after Antipater's death. Cassander, his son and her sworn enemy, was maneuvering to seize total control, and had effectively imprisoned Alexander's widow, Roxana, and the young king, Alexander IV. Olympias saw the writing on the wall. The endgame was approaching. If she did not act now, her grandson, the last link to Alexander, would be quietly murdered and vanish like a shadow at dusk. So, from her base in Epirus, she forged an alliance with Polyperchon, an aging general and Cassander's rival for the regency, a man who still held a flicker of legitimate authority. With Polyperchon's backing, Olympias entered Macedon at the head of her own Epirot army. She was not returning to plead or negotiate. She was returning to rule. The moment her feet touched Macedonian soil, everything changed. The power of her legend was still immense. Towns opened their gates to her without a fight. Macedonian soldiers, veterans who had served her son, defected from the regent's army to join her cause. Even some of her old enemies hesitated. Olympias, now in her 60s, was still a name that shook the ground. Then came her vengeance. It was as spectacular as it was savage. One by one, she hunted down the key supporters and family members of Cassander. Her primary target was Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother, who had been serving as a puppet king for the various regions. When she captured him, she ordered his execution without hesitation. His wife, Eurydice, a fierce and ambitious princess in her own right who had actively fought against Olympias, was also captured. According to the sources, Olympias, in a repeat of her earlier cruelty, gave Eurydice a choice of suicide methods. When she defiantly refused, Olympias had her strangled. It was state-sanctioned murder, veiled in the protocol of royal justice, and Olympias, ever the master of political theater, staged the entire affair like a goddess delivering divine judgment. Her message was brutally, unequivocally clear: only the direct bloodline of my son Alexander has the right to rule this land. Everyone else is a pretender and will be swept aside. For a brief, burning moment, Olympias held the kingdom of Macedon in her grip. She had her grandson, the rightful king, by her side. She had restored her dynasty. She had avenged years of betrayal. She had reminded Macedon what true royal power looked like when wielded by a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose. But power in post-Alexander Macedon was like a fire in dry grass: it burned intensely, but it moved fast and was impossible to contain. And Cassander was still out there. He had been outmaneuvered, but not defeated. He was calculating, biding his time, and gathering his forces. He returned with a vengeance. His army was larger and better supplied than hers, his resources deeper, and his cruelty colder and more methodical. Her allies began to abandon her. Polyperchon's influence waned. The tide of war turned decisively against her. Olympias, now increasingly isolated, retreated to the coastal fortress of Pydna, where she watched as the armies of her most hated enemy closed in. She had lit the match, and Macedon had burned. Now, the smoke was clearing, and her enemies were at the gates. Olympias, once the most powerful and feared woman in the ancient world, now found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna. She was cut off, surrounded by the overwhelming army of Cassander, the man who had come to finish the war his father, Antipater, had started against her decades before. But Olympias did not beg. She did not plead. She did not sue for peace. For the better part of a year, she endured the grueling siege like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food ran out. Water became scarce. Disease crept through the ranks of her loyal garrison. Her remaining allies outside the walls vanished, either defeated or bought off by Cassander. Yet within the fortress, she maintained the same unshakable, regal presence that had once intimidated kings and generals. To the very end, she carried herself not as a trapped animal, but as the mother of a god. Cassander, ever the cautious strategist, hesitated. He knew that killing Olympias outright was a dangerous proposition. Even now, defeated and starving, she carried her myth around her like a suit of armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down personally might be seen as blasphemy by the Macedonian army, many of whom still venerated Alexander's memory. So, he offered her terms. Surrender, he said through his envoys, and he would grant her safe passage to wherever she wished to go. Her life would be spared. Olympias, who had spent a lifetime swimming in a sea of lies and broken promises, knew better. She had seen too many royal guarantees turn to ash. Still, the situation was hopeless. Hunger was no longer a discomfort, it was a daily death. Her garrison finally broke. Her followers surrendered. And Olympias, unbending until the very last moment, was finally handed over to her enemies. Cassander, true to his cold-blooded nature, did not kill her himself. That would have been too simple, too merciful, and too politically risky. Instead, in a move of wicked genius, he convened a sham assembly of the Macedonian army and formally charged her with the murders she had committed during her brief return to power. He then turned her over to the families of those she had executed. Let them be her judges and her executioners. They, of course, condemned her to death. But here, at the very end, the legend of Olympias flared one last time. When the appointed executioners, a squad of armed soldiers, entered the room where she was held, they found her standing tall, regal, silent. Her eyes, which had seen prophecies and kings, were fixed on them, not with fear, but with an ancient authority, like an oracle staring through smoke. And these men, these hardened Macedonian soldiers, faltered. They had grown up hearing the stories of her rituals, her visions, her sacred snakes. They had once cheered her son as a living god. And now, faced with this frail old woman cloaked in decades of myth, not a single one of them had the courage to swing a sword or thrust a spear. They lowered their weapons and backed away. Furious, Cassander sent others. Not soldiers, but the relatives of her victims themselves, men fueled by grief and rage, outsiders to the military code, people who had no memory of her power, only orders to follow and a thirst for revenge. And thus, Olympias was finally struck down. Not in battle, not with ceremony, not with dignity, but in silence, in the dust, by a mob. Her death marked the effective end of Alexander's direct bloodline. It wasn't long before Cassander had Roxana and the young Alexander IV murdered as well. And with them, the final, flickering ember of an empire founded on divine ambition was snuffed out for good. But even in death, Olympias left behind a shadow that history could never quite escape. She had lost the war, but she would win the battle for memory. And the world would never forget the Serpent Queen. Olympias died not on a throne, but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she once ruled. But history is a strange and fickle storyteller. It does not always favor the ones who die peacefully in silk sheets. Sometimes, it grants a peculiar immortality to those who went down hissing. And Olympias was never meant for a quiet history. In life, she had wielded motherhood like a sword and prophecy like a shield. She was not simply the mother of Alexander the Great, a passive vessel for a great man's entry into the world. She was one of the chief architects of his rise. Let's be clear, without her, there is no myth of the divine child. There are no carefully cultivated whispers of thunderbolts and lions. There is no ruthless, surgical purging of rivals that cleared the path for a teenage king to inherit the most powerful army in the world. Olympias didn't just give birth to an empire, she defended it with tooth and claw from the moment of its conception. Yet even when compared to the ancient world's most ruthless and successful dynasts, Olympias stands apart. She didn't command armies in the field like a Cleopatra or ride into battle at the head of a horde like a Boudica. Her battlefield was subtler, colder, and in many ways, far more treacherous. It was a world of poisoned goblets and political marriages, of priestesses and oracles, of whispers in dark corridors. She understood the raw, visceral power of fear, but more importantly, she understood the enduring power of belief. She made an entire civilization believe her son was divine, and it's very likely she believed it, body and soul, herself. Her enemies, both ancient and modern, have branded her a murderer, a witch, a schemer, a venomous manipulator. And they weren't wrong. Olympias was all of those things, and more. She was the product of a brutal, unforgiving world that respected cunning far more than it did kindness. And she learned, very early on, that mercy was a luxury that queens who wished to keep their heads, and their sons on the throne, simply could not afford. In the centuries that followed her death, her story was told and retold. She was both vilified and mythologized, a monster in one account, a visionary in another. But no historian, ancient or modern, could ever call her irrelevant. She haunts the legacy of Alexander like a phantom, a constant presence in the background, a shadow just behind the curtain. And maybe that is exactly where she belongs. Not as a tragic mother or a historical footnote in a great king's story, but as a story unto herself. The woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, who slept beside snakes, and who dared to outlive gods. The bones of Olympias turned to dust long ago, but her legend endures. It endures in every tale of ruthless queens who fight for their children, in every whisper of a destiny written in blood, in every empire built as much on myth as on might. She is still there, coiled in the dark places of history, waiting. Tonight's story begins on an island drenched in a sun so bright it seems to bleach the very color from the sky. We are on Crete, the great cradle of European civilization, just a short drive from the bustling modern city of Heraklion. Here, nestled amongst olive groves and whispering cypress trees, lies a ruin that feels less like a place of stone and mortar, and more like a half-remembered dream you can actually walk through. This place is Knossos. Even today, it confounds the senses. There are no straight boulevards, no simple grid. Instead, stone corridors twist like serpents, leading you deeper into a maze of chambers that seem to fold in on themselves. Rooms open into other rooms, which lead to staircases that climb towards the sky only to end abruptly, leaving you stranded between floors. You can walk for an hour and feel as though you've gone nowhere at all, or turn a corner and find yourself back where you started. It's a place that was designed to make you feel lost, to make you surrender your sense of direction to its own strange logic. This is the heart of the Minoan world, a civilization that blossomed and vanished long before the glories of Athens and Rome. And it is the place believed to have inspired one of the most primal, most enduring myths in all of human history, the legend of the labyrinth and its monstrous inhabitant, the Minotaur. But before the legend, there was the palace. And what a palace it was! First constructed around 1900 BCE, and then rebuilt and expanded over centuries, Knossos wasn't merely a king's residence. It was a city contained under a single, sprawling roof. Imagine a space covering nearly 150,000 square feet, that's about the size of 3 American football fields, filled with over 1,000 interconnected rooms. It was a hive of human activity, containing royal apartments, artisan workshops, vast storage magazines for grain and oil, sacred shrines, and, incredibly, what may be the very first flushing toilets in the history of the world. It had sophisticated systems for running water, multi-story wings that would have towered over the landscape, and a brilliant, passive air conditioning system using light wells and corridors to circulate cool breezes. This was no crude, brutish fortress. This was a masterpiece of architectural and social engineering. To the archaeologists who unearth it, Knossos looks like a puzzle box of organized chaos. To an ancient visitor, stepping off a ship from a simpler, mud-brick village, it must have felt like pure magic. The man who dragged Knossos from the realm of myth into the light of day was a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans. In the very first years of the 20th century, Evans began excavating the site, and he was immediately and utterly captivated. He became convinced, with an almost religious fervor, that he had found the physical origin of the Greek labyrinth myth. The floor plan was impossibly disorienting. The symbolism was profound. And everywhere he looked, the bull was present. It was painted in vibrant frescoes on the walls, its horns were carved into stone altars, it was sculpted into tiny, exquisite golden charms. The bull, he correctly deduced, was the sacred animal of these forgotten people. Evans went so far as to name this entire civilization after the mythical king Minos from the legend. We call them the Minoans today because of him. Whether a king named Minos ever truly walked these halls is a question that may never be answered, but his legend is now fused to these ruins, inseparable from the stones themselves. But here is where our story takes its first twist. For all of Evans's certainty, no one has ever found a literal, subterranean labyrinth. There is no dark, winding maze beneath the palace. No prison cells with claw marks on the walls. And certainly no skeletal remains of a half-man, half-bull monster. What we have instead is something far more subtle, and perhaps far more profound. We have a city palace designed in loops, wings, and layers, a place deliberately, almost playfully, difficult to navigate. The deeper you venture into its history, the more the lines between what was real and what was imagined begin to blur and dissolve. So, the great question remains suspended in the warm Cretan air. Was the story of the Minotaur born from the confusing memory of these walls? Or was the palace itself, in its own way, the real monster? Knossos may not give up its secrets easily, but it is exceptionally good at making us ask the right questions. And that is where our journey begins tonight. The myth is as famous as any story from the ancient world, a tale told and retold for 3,000 years. It speaks of a monstrous creature, the Minotaur, with the body of a man and the head of a bull. This beast was trapped at the center of a labyrinth, an inescapable maze designed by the genius inventor Daedalus. The labyrinth was so complex, so cunningly built, that anyone who entered was doomed to wander its passages until they were found and devoured by the monster. Only one hero, the brave Athenian prince Theseus, ever managed to conquer it. He sailed to Crete, slew the beast in its lair, and found his way out, not through strength or intellect alone, but with the help of a simple ball of thread, given to him by the clever and lovelorn princess, Ariadne. It's a fantastic story. But where did it come from? And why, of all things, a labyrinth? The earliest versions of the myth, which predate even Homer, tell of the mighty king Minos, the undisputed ruler of Crete and the seas around it. As the story goes, Minos's son was killed in Athens, and in his rage, he demanded a terrible tribute. Every 9 years, the city of Athens was forced to send 7 of its finest young men and 7 of its most beautiful young women to Crete. These 14 souls were not taken as slaves or hostages. Their fate was far worse. They were led to the entrance of the labyrinth and sent inside, a human sacrifice to appease the creature within. The Minotaur itself was a product of divine punishment and royal shame. The legend says that King Minos had prayed to the sea god Poseidon for a sign of his divine right to rule. Poseidon answered by sending a magnificent white bull from the waves, with the understanding that Minos would sacrifice it in the god's honor. But Minos, struck by the bull's beauty, decided to keep it and sacrificed a lesser animal instead. You do not cheat a god. As punishment, Poseidon afflicted Minos's wife, Queen Pasiphae, with an unnatural desire for the bull. With the help of the inventor Daedalus, she hid inside a hollow wooden cow, and from this cursed union, the Minotaur was born. It was a living symbol of the king's hubris and the dark, unnatural secret festering at the heart of his glorious kingdom. The labyrinth, then, was not just a prison for the monster, but a place to hide this profound royal disgrace from the world. To the ancient Greeks of the mainland, Crete was a place of immense wealth, deep mystery, and a palpable sense of fear. The Minoans, its seafaring people, were seen as both sophisticated and unervingly alien. Their rituals were strange, their art depicted powerful goddesses and peculiar ceremonies, and their palaces were built on a scale and with a logic that was completely foreign. To a Greek trader visiting from a dusty, fortified town around 1000 BCE, stepping into the vibrant, sprawling complex of Knossos would have felt like entering another world, a world where the rules you understood no longer applied. And everywhere in that world was the bull. The Minoans were obsessed with it. Their most famous frescoes show young men and women, impossibly graceful, vaulting over the backs of charging bulls in what appears to be a highly ritualized display. Stylized bull horns, which archaeologists call horns of consecration, adorned the tops of rooftops and altars. The bull was not a monster to be slain, but a powerful, sacred force to be engaged with, a symbol of nature's untamable energy. Combine this deep cultural reverence for the bull with a palace so vast and confusing that it feels like a maze, and you have all the raw ingredients for a terrifying legend to take root. But what if the Minotaur wasn't just a monster? What if it was a metaphor? Some historians believe the tale is a distorted cultural memory of Cretan dominance over the Aegean Sea. For a time, the Minoan civilization was the superpower of its world, and it's plausible that weaker states like Athens did indeed pay tribute, perhaps in resources or precious metals, not people, to this stronger, stranger power. In this reading, the labyrinth symbolizes the inescapable political and economic trap of being a vassal state, and the Minotaur represents the raw, terrifying force of Minoan naval supremacy that enforced this arrangement. It was the hidden teeth behind their traitors' smiles. Other interpretations are more psychological, viewing the story as an allegory for the human condition. The labyrinth becomes a map of the unconscious mind, with its twisting passages and dark, forgotten corners. The Minotaur is our own inner beast, our hidden fears, our repressed urges, the monstrous parts of ourselves we try to lock away. And Theseus is the hero of consciousness, bravely venturing into the darkness of the self, guided only by the slender thread of logic, memory, or love, to confront what lies within. Still, the myth remains inextricably tangled with the stones of Knossos. The palace is the closest thing our world has ever found to a real, physical labyrinth. There is no monster in its corridors, and no historical record of a princess named Ariadne. But perhaps there is something deeper here. This might not be a case of a simple myth echoing through history, but of a history so strange and overwhelming that it was practically begging to become a myth. Long before Athens constructed its marble temples on the Acropolis, or the warriors of Sparta sharpened their spears and their wits, there existed the Minoan civilization. For over 1,000 years, it was one of the earliest and most brilliant advanced societies in all of Europe. They built their empire not through conquest and military might, but through trade, art, and what appears to have been an almost supernatural command of architecture and engineering. And at the very center of their power, the beating heart of their world, stood Knossos. The Minoans flourished from roughly 2600 to 1450 BC based on their island fortress of Crete. They were masters of the sea. Their sleek, swift ships, propelled by sail and oar, cut through the Mediterranean like silent arrows. They established a sprawling trade network that connected them to the great empires of their day, the Egypt of the pharaohs, the Hittites of Anatolia, the city-states of Mesopotamia and the Levant. They sailed as far as Spain in search of tin, a vital component for making bronze. They brought back copper from Cyprus, gold from Egypt, and ivory from Syria. In return, they exported the treasures of Crete, fine pottery, lustrous textiles, precious saffron, and high-quality olive oil. They didn't build vast armies to subjugate their neighbors, they built relationships. And that, more than any weapon, is what made them wealthy and influential. What is most striking about Minoan culture, especially when you hold it up against their Greek successors, is how fundamentally different their worldview seems to have been. Their art is a celebration of life, nature, and fluid, dynamic movement. It is not filled with scenes of war, conquest, or the wrathful punishments of angry gods. Their frescoes depict dancers with flowing hair, great pods of dolphins leaping from a turquoise sea, and lithe athletes vaulting over bulls. Even their deities feel different. The primary figures we see are powerful, bare-breasted goddesses, often depicted holding snakes, which were ancient symbols of fertility, transformation, and the mysterious power of the earth. These are not passive, remote figures, they are active, present, and radiate authority. And at the center of this vibrant world was Knossos. Significantly, it was not a grim fortress perched on a defensive hilltop. It was an open, unfortified complex situated in a fertile valley. The palace had no massive defensive walls, a fact that has puzzled historians for generations. This suggests the Minoans either felt entirely secure on their island, protected by the sea, or that their naval power and diplomatic influence were so formidable that no one would dare attack them. Their confidence was literally built into their architecture. Their buildings rose 3, 4, even 5 stories high, with colonnaded courtyards, grand staircases, and those incredibly advanced plumbing systems. This points to a highly organized, prosperous society with a deep well of engineering knowledge, far ahead of its time. And yet, for all their sophistication, for all their artistic genius, the Minoans left behind a profound and frustrating silence. Their primary written script, a beautiful syllabic system known as Linear A, remains undeciphered to this day. We can see hints of its structure, but we cannot read its words. This means we don't know what the Minoans called themselves. We don't know the names of their kings or the true nature of their government. We don't know what prayers they spoke to their snake goddesses, or what stories they told their children about the bull leapers. All we have are their ruins, their art, and the echoes of their influence, which were later absorbed by the Mycenaean Greeks and twisted into the myths we know today. The Minoans were not just builders of palaces, they were architects of mystery. And Knossos was not merely a building. It was the vibrant, beating heart of a civilization that shimmered for a moment like sunlight on the Aegean Sea, and then, almost without a trace, vanished. But some say its echo still wanders the maze. To walk through the ruins of Knossos is to walk through time itself, a time that is layered, confusing, and breathtakingly beautiful. It isn't just the sheer scale of the place that overwhelms you, it's the deliberate, almost playful complexity of its design. Rooms spill into other rooms. Corridors branch off, split, and sometimes simply vanish into a wall. Immense light wells, like architectural arteries, cut through the very heart of the building, plunging down several stories to bring light and air into the deepest chambers. Stairs spiral down into shadow or emerge, suddenly and unexpectedly, into sun-drenched courtyards. Nothing here moves in a straight line. The entire complex seems to reject the very idea of linear progression. It's not difficult to imagine how ancient visitors, accustomed to simpler structures, might have returned home whispering tales of a labyrinth. Knossos wasn't just a palace, it was a living, breathing organism. Sprawling across an estimated 150,000 square feet, the complex housed over 1,000 distinct chambers, some no bigger than a closet, others grand and ceremonial. These were not randomly placed. Archaeologists have identified purpose-built workshops for potters, weavers, and jewelers, vast storage magazines lined with enormous clay jars called pithoi, capable of holding thousands of gallons of oil, wine, and grain, sacred shrines tucked into quiet corners, private residential apartments, and of course, the grand public rooms and throne rooms. All of this activity was arranged around a massive central court, an open-air plaza that likely served as the communal and ceremonial heart of the palace, perhaps hosting public gatherings, religious ceremonies, or even the famous bull-leaping rituals themselves. The palace was constructed on multiple levels, rising up to 4 or 5 stories in some sections by masterfully exploiting the natural slopes of the hill and constructing artificial terraces. To navigate it without a guide would require an impeccable memory, a powerful sense of intuition, or, like Theseus, a ball of thread. And yet, hidden within this apparent chaos is a remarkable and sophisticated intelligence. The Minoan architects were masters of climate control. Long before the invention of modern HVAC, they engineered a system of passive ventilation, using the light wells and strategically placed air shafts to create convection currents that would draw cool air through the complex during the hot Cretan summers. They captured and channeled rainwater through a network of interlocking terracotta pipes, providing fresh water to various parts of the palace. And then there's the plumbing. In an age when most of the world considered a hole in the ground to be peak sanitation technology, the Minoans were engineering toilets that flushed with stored rainwater, a luxury that wouldn't become common in Europe for another 3,000 years. One of the most iconic and enigmatic areas is the so-called throne room. The name, given by Arthur Evans, is captivating but perhaps misleading. It's a surprisingly small chamber, dominated by a high-backed gypsum chair, the throne, built directly into the wall and flanked by stone benches. The walls around it are decorated with magnificent frescoes of griffins, mythical creatures with the body of a lion and the head of an eagle, standing as eternal guardians in a field of reeds. Was this truly the seat of a priest-king? Or was it the chamber of a high priestess, a place for receiving divine oracles? Or perhaps it was a sacred court where ritual disputes were settled. No one knows for certain. And the walls, they speak in a language of color. Vibrant frescoes show us a world teeming with life. Blue dolphins swim in stylized waves above what appears to be a bathtub in the Queen's Megaron. Elegantly dressed women, with elaborate hairstyles, flounced skirts, and conspicuously bare chests, gossip in groups. Blue-painted monkeys climb rocks. And everywhere, there are the youths, both male and female, leaping over charging bulls, their bodies captured in a moment of impossible, weightless grace. This art wasn't mere decoration, it was the expression of their identity, fluid, natural, and deeply connected to the earth and the sea. Still, the deeper you go into Knossos, the more it begins to disorient you. Some sections seem intentionally convoluted, as if they were designed not for efficiency, but to confuse or test the visitor. Perhaps that is the true root of the labyrinth legend. Not a purpose-built prison for a monster, but a palace that was so alive, so complex, that it felt like an entity in its own right. A building that was designed to inspire awe, facilitate ritual, and instill just a touch of reverent fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts. Just a place built to make you question where you were, and what marvel, or mystery, was waiting around the next corner. Knossos was not just an administrative hub or a royal residence. It was, in its essence, a place of worship. It was an architectural expression of the Minoan soul, a space steeped in ritual, myth, and a profound sense of divine mystery. Unlike the later Greek world, with its clearly defined temples dedicated to specific gods, the towering columns of the Parthenon for Athena, the shrine at Delphi for Apollo, the spiritual world of Knossos is far more subtle. It is woven directly into the very fabric of the building itself. There are no grand, stand-alone temples here. Instead, shrines hide in small, intimate corners of the palace. Pillars are not just structural supports, they are often painted and seem to rise like sacred sentinels, perhaps embodying a divine presence themselves. Those horns of consecration, the stylized, carved bull horns, appear on rooftops and atop altars, marking spaces as sacred. And everywhere you look, the bull motif dominates, suggesting a powerful, elemental connection between their worship, the natural world, and this revered animal. The Minoans didn't seem to fear the bull, they celebrated it, they danced with it. The famous bull-leaping fresco at Knossos is more than just athletic art. It most likely depicts a core religious rite, a dangerous and graceful ritual. We see three figures in sequence. One grasps the bull's horns to begin the vault, another is captured mid-air, somersaulting over the animal's back, and a third stands with arms outstretched, ready to catch the leaper. This was not a sport like a modern rodeo, where man dominates beast. This was sacred theater, a dance with chaos. It was possibly a rite of passage, an offering to the gods, or a symbolic performance of humanity's ability to find grace and order in the face of nature's awesome power. Then there are the snake goddesses. Discovered by Evans in a hidden, stone-lined pit beneath the palace floor, these small figurines are among the most iconic and powerful artifacts of the Minoan world. They depict female figures with wide eyes, bare breasts, and arms raised, holding serpents that coil around their hands and bodies. These are not submissive idols. They radiate a primal, chthonic power. They are guardians of the household, emblems of fertility, and masters of life, death, and rebirth. To the Minoans, as in many ancient cultures, the snake symbolized renewal and transformation, its ability to shed its skin made it a potent emblem of cyclical life. The hidden rooms where these figurines were found suggest private household shrines or sacred repositories, quiet, holy corners hidden within the bustling heart of the palace. When you combine the ever-present frescoes, the sacred horns, the altars, the pillar crypts, and the labyrinthine corridors, the entire complex begins to feel like a great ritual machine. It was a structure built not just for living, but for connecting with the divine. There is no centralized temple at Knossos because the palace itself was the temple. Its layout, its art, and its very design were all part of a holistic spiritual worldview where the boundaries between the sacred and the secular, the human and the divine, simply did not exist. This was a place where myth was made manifest in architecture, where a corridor could become a symbolic passage to the underworld, and where every echo in its stone chambers may have once been a whispered prayer. Knossos didn't just house people. It housed their gods. For centuries, Knossos stood as a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and cultural sophistication in the Bronze Age Aegean. But then, sometime around 1450 BCE, something happened. Something sudden, something catastrophic, something that scholars are still fiercely debating today. The palace was damaged, its administration collapsed, the frescoes were left to fade, and the vibrant Minoan civilization that had once ruled the seas vanished like mist over the mountains. So, what happened? Theories abound, and the evidence is a complex tapestry of clues. The first and most dramatic suspect is Mother Nature. Around 1600 BCE, a century and a half before the final fall, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, about 70 miles north of Crete, erupted in one of the largest explosions in recorded human history. The blast was hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. It likely generated colossal tsunamis that would have slammed into Crete's northern coast, obliterating its port towns, its merchant fleets, and the coastal farmland. A vast plume of volcanic ash would have blotted out the sun for days or weeks, choking crops, poisoning livestock, and disrupting the climate across the region. While Knossos itself wasn't immediately destroyed by the eruption, the long-term aftermath may have fatally shaken the foundations of Minoan society. Their naval power, the source of their wealth and security, would have been crippled. The agricultural failure would have led to famine and social unrest. And perhaps most importantly, it could have triggered a profound crisis of faith. What kind of gods would allow such a cataclysm to befall their chosen people? The second major theory points to war. By 1450 BCE, a new power was rising on the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans. These were a more militaristic, aggressive people, the culture of heroes like Agamemnon and Achilles. It's possible they took advantage of a weakened Minoan state. The archaeological evidence from the final period of Knossos is telling. The culture changed. The art style became more rigid and martial. And most critically, the Minoan script, Linear A, was replaced by a new script called Linear B, an early form of Greek used by Mycenaean scribes for their meticulous, almost obsessive, record-keeping. The palace that once thrived with art celebrating snake goddesses and bull dancers now whispered in a foreign tongue about inventories of chariots, weapons, and personnel. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans didn't invade in a single, bloody conquest, but gradually infiltrated and absorbed the island, first through trade, then by gaining political influence, and finally by taking control. Others argue that the collapse came from within. A devastating civil uprising, a breakdown in the complex palatial economy, or a failure of the ruling elite to manage the crises facing them may have contributed just as much as any external threat. What's most striking, however, is the lack of widespread evidence for a violent end. There are no layers of ash from a final, fiery sack of the palace. No mass graves of slaughtered defenders. Knossos did not fall with a scream, it seems to have fallen with a whisper. The great, complex palatial system simply ceased to function. The workshops fell silent, the storage jars stood empty, the rituals ended, and nature slowly, patiently, began its work of creeping back in. By the time the poet Homer was singing of Crete in his epics, hundreds of years later, Knossos was already an ancient ruin, a place of myth. Its history had become tangled in hazy stories of powerful kings, terrifying monsters, and inescapable labyrinths. And maybe that's a fitting end. Because what ultimately killed Knossos wasn't just a volcanic eruption or a foreign invasion. It was time. And the inevitable way that all great and beautiful things, no matter how advanced, eventually vanish beneath the weight of new empires and new stories. But the bones of the palace remain. And if you listen closely, in the quiet of the afternoon, you can almost hear the maze still humming beneath the earth. For more than 3,000 years, Knossos lay buried and forgotten beneath the Cretan soil. It was just another mound of earth, known to locals as Kephula, its name lost, its myths distorted, its magnificent walls swallowed by olive groves and thick layers of dust. That is, until one man, driven by a powerful obsession, decided to chase a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and he didn't just rediscover Knossos, in many ways, he reinvented it. In the year 1900, Evans, a wealthy British archaeologist with a flair for the dramatic and a lifelong passion for Homeric myth, purchased the land that covered the ancient ruins. For years, local Cretan farmers had been turning up strange, inscribed seal stones and fragments of pottery while plowing their fields, tantalizing clues that something enormous lay just beneath the surface. Evans, convinced that Crete was the key to understanding the origins of Greek civilization, began to dig. What he found would not only change the history of the Aegean, it would give Europe a whole new, forgotten prehistory. He unearthed a palace so vast, so architecturally complex, and so technologically advanced that he was immediately certain he had found the mythical home of King Minos. The labyrinthine floor plan, the omnipresent bull frescoes, the sheer, alien strangeness of the site, it all pointed, in his mind, to one inescapable conclusion: this was the labyrinth of legend. But Evans was not just a dispassionate archaeologist. He was a storyteller, a showman, and, at times, a deeply controversial figure. He was the one who named the people who built Knossos the Minoans, forever linking them to the mythic king. He didn't just excavate, he interpreted, often with bold and imaginative leaps. He reconstructed the faded frescoes based on tiny surviving fragments, and most controversially, he restored large sections of the palace itself, using modern reinforced concrete to raise columns and rebuild entire wings. This act of reconstruction has drawn both praise for its vision and sharp criticism for its methods. Some see it as a brilliant way to give visitors a tangible sense of the palace's original scale and grandeur. Others see it as an act of historical vandalism, an Edwardian fantasy projected onto an authentic Bronze Age ruin. When you visit Knossos today, what you are seeing is a hybrid, part ancient stone, part early 20th century imagination. Still, for all the debate, Evans did what no one else had dared. He brought Knossos back to life. He gave the world a stunning glimpse into a Bronze Age civilization far older and, in many ways, more sophisticated than classical Greece. He revealed a world of maritime elegance, vibrant art, and profound mystery. He also unearthed thousands of clay tablets inscribed with both the still undeciphered Linear A script and the later, readable Linear B, opening up entirely new questions about language, literacy, and the limits of our historical understanding. But Evans did something more than excavate stone and clay. He resurrected a myth. He forced historians to reckon with the astonishing fact that behind the fantastic legend of the Minotaur and the labyrinth, there was something real. Something complex. Something undeniably human. A palace that felt like a maze, a civilization that had slipped into shadow, and a man who peeled back the earth only to discover a story far stranger and more beautiful than even he could have imagined. Knossos had slept for 3 millennia. Arthur Evans was the one who rang the bell that woke it up. Walk through Knossos, and you are not just walking through architecture. You are walking through a language of symbols. Frescoes, carvings, patterns, and motifs are everywhere, on every surface. But the Minoans did not leave us a Rosetta Stone to translate their visual world. As we've learned, their primary script, Linear A, remains a tantalizing enigma. So, instead of reading their history, their poetry, or their laws, we are forced to see their thoughts, painted across plaster, carved into stone, and hidden in the rhythm of their designs. What exactly were they trying to say? The art of Knossos is utterly unique in the ancient world. There is no grim obsession with warfare, no stiff, monumental statues of kings, no reliefs of battle-hardened heroes vanquishing their enemies. Instead, we find a world pulsating with nature. We see leaping dolphins, blooming lilies, vibrantly colored birds in flight, and sacred bulls. The humans depicted are alive, elegant, and almost always engaged in movement, dancing, participating in processions, or performing rituals. Even in scenes that suggest danger, like the bull leaping, there is a sense of rhythm, cooperation, and sublime beauty. The Minoans weren't chronicling their conquests, they were celebrating life cycles, the patterns of nature, and perhaps a cosmic order that bound them all together. The most persistent and powerful symbol throughout the palace is the labrys, or double axe. It is found everywhere, incised on the great stone pillars of the crypts, painted on pottery, depicted in frescoes, and crafted as votive offerings. The double axe is widely believed to be a central religious symbol, possibly tied to a primary female divinity or to celestial cycles. Some scholars have even proposed that the very word labyrinth is not Greek in origin, but is derived from labrys. If this is true, labyrinth would not mean maze at all, but rather the house of the double axe. This would reframe the entire myth. Knossos wasn't a prison, but a sacred space, a sanctuary. Then there are the horns of consecration, those stylized bull horns placed atop walls and altars. These likely served as religious markers, separating a sacred space from the mundane world, much like a cross on a church. Combined with the constant depictions of bulls and the bull-leaping rituals, it's clear this animal held a deep and complex spiritual significance. Whether it represented the untamable power of nature, masculine fertility, the chaos that must be ritually overcome, or a divine presence itself, no one can agree. But the bull is the silent, powerful center around which so much of Minoan ritual seems to turn. Even the very layout of Knossos may have symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists have argued that it was designed not just for practical function, but to mirror celestial alignments or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a symbolic journey, a journey through life, into death, and toward rebirth. The palace itself could be a kind of spiritual maze, a map of their cosmology, not a physical prison. But without a deciphered script, every theory walks a fine and dangerous line between brilliant insight and sheer imagination. The Minoans spoke to us in a rich language of symbols, but we have lost the key to their grammar. We are left to interpret, to guess, to feel our way through their world. We hear the rhythms in their art, we see the recurring images, but the precise meaning, the story they were telling themselves, that remains just out of reach, like a thread unraveling into myth. Knossos is a ruin, yes, but it does not feel dead. Walk its restored corridors today, amidst the throngs of tourists and the hum of cicadas, and you can still sense something humming just beneath the surface. It's not the presence of ghosts or ancient gods, but the persistent echo of myths, of lives lived, and of questions that refuse to go away. Thousands of years after its final, quiet fall from grace, Knossos still holds us within its maze. Tourists wander its halls, trying to make sense of the map in their hands. Archaeologists continue to dig for answers in the soil around it. And writers and artists continue to spin new tales inspired by its enigmatic shadow. The Minotaur may be a myth, but the feeling of the labyrinth, the sense of being in a place larger and more complex than you can comprehend, is undeniably real. We do not know who truly ruled Knossos. We don't know the names of its kings, its queens, or its priests. We don't know the prayers they whispered in the pillar crypts or the laws they lived by. But we know they loved beauty. We know they worshipped nature. We know they understood a profound balance between architecture and art, between ritual and reality. And we know they were the first. Before the Parthenon stood white against the Athens sky, before the Colosseum echoed with the roar of the Roman crowd, before the great temples of Jerusalem or the palaces of Persia, there was Knossos. A palace that was also a city. A city that was also a temple. And a temple that may have also been, in its very form, a story. Because perhaps that is what the labyrinth truly is. Not a prison, not a puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone. A myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur did not arise from nothing. It came from this place, from the sensory confusion of its corridors, from the awesome reverence of its bull rituals, and from the deep, unsettling awe it inspired in generations of visitors who tried, and failed, to fully make sense of it. The Greeks turned that feeling into a story of a hero and a monster. We have turned it into archaeology and historical debate. But at its core, Knossos has always been both. Today, we can walk its ruins in the broad daylight. We can take photographs, draw maps, and digitally reconstruct its frescoes. But the mystery has not vanished. The line between fact and legend still shimmers like heat rising from the ancient stones. Maybe that is why Knossos endures, why it continues to fascinate us so deeply. It is because it doesn't give us all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes, history isn't meant to be solved. It's meant to be felt. And Knossos, ancient, tangled, beautiful, and half-remembered, isn't just a place on a map. It's a question. One that leads us deeper and deeper into the past with every step we take. And like Theseus so long ago, we are all still following the thread.